Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. Didn't I promise you that the fire was only set to rage evermore? I am so excited today to be joined by author, broadcaster, and just all-around incredible, intelligent, and thoughtful Iman Rappetti. Iman, thank you so much for joining us.
Sizwe, hi, thank you. Say it louder for the people at the back.
SMWX.
It sounds ominous. It sounds like one of those channels we don't speak about publicly.
Wow, we haven't got that before.
Just kidding.
So I was criticized recently because apparently my dance moves are more closer to Mandela than they are to former President Zuma. So I'm working on that.
But Mandela's became iconic.
That's what I'm saying.
You know what I'm
saying? I was just trying to reference an older move. It doesn't mean I can't do other moves. It's so exciting to have you here. And I'm lucky because I get to interview you.
What I can confess to is that I'm feeling deeply uncomfortable about being on the other side of the microphone.
Well, it's revenge.
Now I have to reveal. Now you have to unpeel my layers.
Exactly. It's revenge because I remember being on the other side of various interviews. So thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
And the first thing I wanted to ask, it's kind of weird to me because we're turning 25 as a democracy. There hasn't been any real fanfare or any real expense spent on reflecting on that. And I wonder if that's maybe because we're a bit embarrassed about where we are as a society. Firstly, just taking a bit of a long view, how do you reflect on where our society is 25 years after the constitutional moment dawned?
You know, it's always going to be a case of where you choose to look. You know, if you go back to communities that we're from, if you grew up in poorer communities like I did, the sense of change not significantly having come, you know, where people, young men in particular, continue to stay unemployed. They don't see their prospects in any different way through a different lens of 25 years later. On the other hand, you know, you'll see older women in the community who are grateful to have a social grant, who are grateful to have some kind of welfare safety net. So it's a very nuanced story, as most things you would know in South Africa are. How do we evaluate where we are 25 years later? I think the question in itself is actually quite complex. The thing about us in South Africa, we've always sought to put labels on things. We wanted to ride the rainbow, then the rainbow didn't work because it was a mirage, it was a chimera. We wanted to talk about a national identity. Well, what the heck is that when real fundamental issues about structural injustice still prevail in our society? So we've always been this kind of society that's yearning for something that identifies us and puts us all under the same roof, in the same house, and yet there are schisms left, right, and center. I actually think that's okay, because there's a realism attached to that.
And how do you think this election responds to that nuance? The fact that on the one hand, there may well be areas in our society that we take for granted that have actually advanced tremendously, while on the other, these schisms remain. Do you feel like the election that we're about to go into is grappling with the nuance of our society at the moment? You know,
you have to make a sort of thoughtful reflection about how political parties define and devise their messaging. Some of it is quite anachronistic. It's almost stale. Like you wish, similar to what you're doing is being a little bit disruptive, that political parties would be a bit disruptive in the way they talk to people, in the way that they get feedback. But our democracy, in my mind, is contrary to the expectation of the definition of democracy, which is government for the people, by the people. I don't know how much of what we're living is an imposition of, decisions that are made for us, rather than the reverse of where it's a downward, upward kind of listening. Here's where we are in this corner of South African society. This is what we're yearning for. This is what we want you to tell us how you're going to help us fix together. Sometimes we hold the solution. Stop imposing things on us. I don't think that listening has been a two-way exercise in our society. I don't think so. I think some parties might have tapped into, areas that are huge pulsation points for us as a democracy: land, economic advancement, social cohesion, whatever that means, because it's, again, another complicated term. But I don't think, when you talk about capturing the imagination, standing on the precipice of 25 years later and looking backwards, I don't know that we've arrived at that pinnacle moment, because there's just so much happening. I mean, it reminds me, and I always quote to my listeners, this old struggle song, "We can run and shoot at the same time." That's what we've been doing, been running and shooting at the specters of the past. That I don't think that we've had a moment to rest and to really reflect and to really appreciate where we are all these years later in a substantive and thoughtful way.
That's true. It does feel like so much has happened. Let's not even talk about the last 25 years, just like in the last 5 minutes, it feels that we're always chasing some news cycle or chasing some crisis. And just as we've recovered from that, we're on to the next one. And it can be quite hard as a South African to sometimes sit back and just reflect on all of this complexity, all of this beauty, all of the grotesque inequality that comes together at the same time. And that can, I think, place, like sometimes I wonder, what is the psychological burden of being a South African? Like if you could test that medically and like trace the cortisol levels in your body of just being in this country, like what would that be like?
Shall I open up your skull?
Oh,
and see, again, as you say, there's such a burdening. It reminds me of a conversation I had just yesterday. I have a teenage daughter. I know I like to pretend to be young, but she is going to be 19 this year, so she's quite a well-evolved young lady.
Hope she's a subscriber.
She will be. And I'll tell you why she hasn't yet, because she is staying, I think she's trying to be pure in her political responses rather than trying to, again, ascribe a label to herself, a house of belonging politically, that, she becomes a spokesperson for, even a soul spokesperson for, something that she really believes in. She's got her options open. But she was telling me about a presentation, a business proposal that somebody was doing, which was about how to kind of advance the discussion around culture. And she said, what is that, how does that talk to me? And somebody said, because the term coloured still prevails in South Africa, as derogatory and as distasteful in my mind as that is. And somebody said do you coloureds even have a culture? Do you coloureds even have a culture? And it led her to telescope back into her own experience as a young person in South Africa about, even in the House of Blackness, which Biko describes, we all are residents of, how there are schisms among us, a lack of understanding. We didn't choose to be born into a society where our intersections are so different from the other, which almost writhe and rage against the kind of collective label that apartheid sought to put on people of colour in our country. My mother was referred to as an other coloured because the pencil test didn't work, but then she was incredibly light-skinned.
So cool.
They didn't know what to do with her. I'm sure you, and your family has an experience of this. So again, it's us constantly asking questions around identity. Where do I fit in? How do I define myself? And why do I feel the need that there has to be a singular label that encapsulates everything that I am? Again, it's a realm of diversity that we have to celebrate. Hybridization, to use a colloquial, maybe derogatory term, is something that benefits humankind. It makes us stronger. It makes us take the best of each other and kind of house it in one entity. But we don't see these as opportunities. We see these as sites for warfare, for cultural warfare, for identity warfare, and a re-traumatization of groups of people that were already traumatized under apartheid.
So I'm really fascinated in the way you reflect on questions of identity, given that you occupy multiple worlds across a diversity of dimensions. And how has your identity as someone who was raised both in what we call the Indian and coloured communities in South Africa reshaped, and how does it continue to reshape your view of race in our country at the moment?
Well, the answer has to come in two forms. One is a sanguine response and the other is deeply melancholic. The sanguine says, I'm so happy that I've had the multiplicity of experiences that I have. So I grew up in KZN. I understand Zulu culture quite well because there's an immersion of Zuluness in KZN that I relate to. The music, the language, people, geographical sites. So there's that. Indian, my father, his family came from the old country in India. They were babies on the last ship that came to South Africa, and they made their lives here as people that grew fresh produce and sold that. Then there's my mom, who has got zero Khoisan heritage, whose grandmother came from St. Helena and whose grandfather was an army officer. in that weird mix, and we're all lumped together. So the sanguine says, oh, but I can draw on all of these rich cultures. Even just geographically being in KZN, there's a richness about black culture that I so deeply resonate with that I'm almost superimposing on myself, and it's part of my psyche. Indian, the same, language, food, tradition, religion, so-called colored as well. There's such a rich diversity in that. But the melancholy seeps in when I realize that the reality of our lived experience in South Africa is still so deeply derogatory, separating, racist, even amongst ourselves. So when I grew up, I didn't have straight hair. I mean, now with salon products, you can be anything you want to. But, growing up with hair that's not quite straight, a nose that's not quite sharp, or skin that didn't quite meet the requisite criteria, you're always betwixt and between. Always felt such a deep sense of not belonging, of pain and of sadness. Even today, as I claim my place in the house of blackness, as Biko prescribed, I feel like I'm also laying claim to something that maybe I'm being an imposter about. Can I really claim to be black in our society where, as a black South African during apartheid, my experience of blackness was not the same experience as my counterparts in KwaMashu, in Ntuzuma, in Claremont, where black people lived. So, by assimilating in that way, am I robbing, am I taking from their history a history that I should not lay claim to?
Sure.
I said so much there, the Lord was leading me now. Okay. I mean, I'm speaking to you from the heart and what my spirit says to tell you.
Yeah.
So, the juxtapositions, can I say I'm really black when I know that living in Phoenix as an Indian or mixed race person was a different lived experience during apartheid to my counterparts in KwaMashu, right next door, where black people lived, or in Ntuzuma, or Umlazi, or wherever. So it's this, Sizwe, there's no easy answer to this, and I don't think that you can arrive at a conclusion that says, okay, this is what I am. And that's in part what saddens me, is that I have to constantly explain myself, or feel like I have to explain myself, or that my children feel like they have to explain themselves. And there are pains associated with that. There are wounds and rewounding that happen constantly. And I'm sure it's not just for me, but for many people in South Africa who carry the stain and the burden of the past.
Absolutely, and I think in many ways our politics often fails to grapple with these complexities and enforces a very simplistic way of identifying ourselves and other people within our country. And I wonder to what extent that damages us. I wanted to ask you, though, on a more electoral 2019 election level, what I admire about you as a broadcaster, and I really do believe you're one of the best in the country, if not the best, is... okay, now I asked the hard question. No, is that closer to the immediate election that's in front of us, I think a lot of people admire your dedication to fairness in broadcasting. And so I now get
That's good to hear.
Now I get a chance to actually ask you, so what do you think? But when we look at, say, the ANC, the DA and the EFF, take us through what you think have been their strengths and their weaknesses in this election and in this campaign.
I don't know about you, but I'm longing for something completely fresh and disruptive in the way that political parties will campaign. I know the door-to-doors are great, but people say, well, we only see, and by the way, in my mother's community, they used to give biryani in Durban. and then the
Where do I sign up for that? Because that would be great.
I don't know if it was meat biryani, though, or whether it was veg. But so they would roll into town and you'd see people sort of once a year or around election season. I suppose, okay, maybe it still has currency. But I think that if democracy is about really listening to people on an ongoing basis, being connected to their struggles. For me, hearing the president talk about being shocked to the point where there's a new moniker for him, Rama shocked, whether it's trains or service delivery or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
There's, to me, a dislocation between the carriers of the message, the meaning of the message and the people the message is supposed to encapsulate or encompass. If I kind of cast my beady eye across the election terrain and you ask me to kind of measure their fairness, you would have to question what yardstick I'd be measuring.
Sure.
So if I'm going to use the yardstick of what's had kind of the most reverb or has captured people's imagination, without a doubt, we're going to have to talk about the EFF. We're going to have to talk about how kind of like the stale rafters of Parliament have been lifted up and they've kind of shaken things up, not always in their favor, where there have been allegations of assaults or, bad manners or whatever in Parliament. But they have made people turn their eyes towards Parliament and look and take cognizance of the substantive issues. And of course, raising issues like land or really whipping the horse of job creation really hard are themes that have captured people's imagination, if I'm using social media as a barometer of gauging that interest. The ANC, again, where is the mind-capturing, moment-capturing moment? I mean, I don't know where that is. And there's an opportunity, I would suggest, for someone in their war room and their comms team to try something totally different, whatever that is. I mean, I'm not going to give advice for free. The DA as well, it's interesting that they haven't been able to kind of escape this mold of whiteness, which is what, the people that I engage with on my radio show or on social media keep lamenting about. So collectively, they all have their work cut out for them. For the EFF is, are we still fighting for legitimacy to be accepted in a particular way as a mature party because we're so new?
Sure.
Where does that leave us? With the ANC, with all of its record in 25 years, how far has that gotten us? And the DA in really reimagining and reinventing itself. So I think they've all got their work cut out for them. Messaging, pretty much, look, everyone's got the big issues in their election manifestos.
Yeah.
It is the granular detail that I'm finding, based on my interviews, that is slightly lacking in how we actually connect this objective to this process that ultimately achieves what people want.
And I think a big part of any election, on the one hand, is what the political parties who are contesting say, but the other part is the way those conversations are being framed and being disseminated and sent through the media. So how do you reflect on South Africa's current media landscape, and how do you think that might be succeeding or failing in presenting citizens, people, mothers, fathers, with the information that they need to make a determination, not just about an election, but about where the society needs to go?
One would hope that collectively we're doing a good job, and I am not a spokesperson for the media, this, monolithic entity or this huge structure. But just my observation, when I hear people on my radio show talk about not being listened to, or they'll raise their cries and politicians aren't hearing because it's not making the news headlines, or the nation's imagination being captured by what we describe as the mainstream media deciding the news trajectory for that particular day is going to be. There's a lot of room in my mind for a more visceral telling and a more kind of all-encompassing telling of our stories, whether they come from the remotest part of the country to the more suburban and urbanized areas. I think that there is a dislocation. I think that a lot more can be done if you are listening to the way people feel disenfranchised still from having a chance of holding the megaphone to their mouths and making their voices louder. By the way, an adage I hate is the voice for the voiceless. People very definitely have a voice.
Sure.
They very definitely have a face. Our role as the media is to apply a megaphone and a mirror to their context and get out of the way and let the people tell their story. And again, I think you're right about framing. Framing is so important. How you ask a question is so key, and you can lead an answer in a particular direction. I'm dying to hear, I wish we had more listening posts in our country where people had access to be able to say, this is us, this is our situation, and here's how we differ from another rural community somewhere else in the country. We're not all the same. Our issues are not all the same. That's where community media, I think, has a crucial role to play. I think they are underutilized. I remember trying on my program to kind of tap into Caxton media or local sort of grassroots media that we call, to get a listen to their journalists and what stories they're covering. Is it crime? Is it service delivery? Is it domestic violence? And that was really useful, and I think we need to do more of that.
I think there's a great sense, I certainly get it on the channel, that there's maybe something of a lager mentality within the mainstream South African media. And let me not suggest that the media is also under attack in many ways, and that's also really bad in our society. But I feel like maybe because the media is such a punching bag for political parties, we often don't interrogate problems in the mainstream media as we do with political parties, because there's almost a defensive response from practitioners in the media. Which
You're being so delicate, Sizwe.
which is understandable. How do you reflect on that?
I mean, I do think that when there's a context of attack, maybe there would be a response of defense.
Yeah.
And I would say, I mean, there are a couple of issues. If you work in a newsroom, first of all, I mean, I'm still a proponent of your classical style journalism, where you might have a beef reporter, somebody who is a specialist in their field, be it on health or crime watch,
Sure.
politics or whatever, because they have the institutional memory that comes with having covered something for a long time. So you can hold a minister to account, but say, but in 2008, you made this promise, never quite happened. What's your story? I don't think that we also have the ability to hold people who were in office previously to account, because they go out of office and then the new guy says, oh, there's legacy issues, I'm just picking up the pieces kind of thing. So I think that's where it becomes very difficult as journalists to stay focused on one thing, because as you pointed out, newsroom resources are depleting, newspapers, circulation numbers are going down. You're not able to offer the salaries of the more experienced institutional journalists. So you're getting, younger journalists in who still have to learn the trade. And they're kind of like having to do really important assignments that require the long view when they haven't been trained or haven't had the experience yet of how to do that. So those are some of the addended issues. Where the concerns come in, Sizwe, which I think you're also pointing to, is whether there is agenda setting or there's a targeting from a media perspective of this or that party, this or that individual. And I think we can only tell, based on how those things evolve. You have to stay with the story. The allegation that was made about person X, was it followed through? Did it result in a charge? Did it result in a court case? Were they jailed and prosecuted? Or are suggestions just left hanging in the air because of both what's happening through the failures of law enforcement or the inability of us to just stay on a story that results in a situation where we don't have clarity? And I think these things layer and layer and layer themselves to the point where you feel like we don't quite know where they are. In the last year, there's been such a deluge of information. I mean, think just from the commissions alone, how much information has poured out like a tsunami. Yeah. Where do you even begin to make sense of it, put it in its place? We have this lingering issue just like with today, with Pravin Gordhan, the Public Enterprises Minister, Public Protector's Office with Sizwe Mkhwebane, and his office is saying, this matter has been resolved. We've had the commission. She's saying, I've still got lingering questions. The EFF's kind of, brought a new thing for her to look at, which is what they're pursuing now. As a listener, as a viewer, you think, well, what is going on? And that for me is a scary place for us to be in, because if it engenders a lack of trust in the media, we're losing something very valuable in the fourth estate. On the other hand, when we get things wrong, there's an immense amount of damage, reputational damage, trust damage that is done by a singular story that could take years, years to build. So again, it's complex. May I just say as a final word on this question, that what we absolutely should not do is outsource our opinions.
SMWX. No young people are around the decision-making table. Let some new voices come to the fore. Follow us on WhatsApp and catch us live Tuesdays and Thursdays. Out with the old, in with the new. SMWX. We'll continue our discussion in further bonus material on the WhatsApp channel.